All right, welcome to part 2 of chapter 6, Designing a Motivating Work Environment. Part 2 is very straightforward, so I think you'll find this to be a pretty quick narrated PowerPoint. We're going to start by talking about performance appraisals. So what is this stuff exactly? What is performance management? As it says here, we're talking about the methods that organizations use to support and improve employee performance. So you'll recall, performance is our number one dependent variable that we care about. If, in fact, we want our employees to be able to improve their performance, to become more effective, meaning better at accomplishing their goals, and more efficient, meaning accomplishing more with less input, well, then we've got to be able to give them feedback. Recall also how important feedback is for people with a high need for achievement. These are the folks who really want to know how they're doing so that they can make whatever changes are necessary to improve. Also, we know from everything we've studied about motivation that, again, feedback really makes a difference. Recall the job characteristics model, the model that I said possibly was the best for trying to ensure that as managers, as leaders, we're giving employees good jobs. Remember that feedback is one of the 5 core job characteristics. Performance management is essentially the formal way that we give people feedback. If you think about the college classroom, performance management is all about the grades, not just what they are, but also how they're awarded, the timing that they're awarded with, whether you have the opportunity to talk with the professor before or after the grade is assigned. All of that is part of the performance management system. If we stay focused on organizations outside of the classroom, as it says here, performance appraisal is a process through which employee performance is measured and then communicated. And this process is the one that's typically used to make decisions about pay raises, promotion decisions, and terminations, where people are let go. In the last, I would say, 20 years, organizations have done quite a bit of experimentation with different formats, trying to find better ways to, in fact, deliver performance management. Part of what needs to be resolved is, what's the purpose? So when we're deciding our performance management system, when we're thinking about those performance appraisals, we need to give careful thought to what we're trying to accomplish. Sometimes what we're trying to accomplish is promotion or salary review. Other times we're looking to develop people, to give them feedback, as I said, on what they're doing. In the case of promotion or salary review, what the research suggests is that appraisal ratings tend to be more generous and also less accurate. And this makes sense, right? Basically, as a manager, as a leader, when we're doing a performance appraisal that we know is going to affect whether someone is likely to be promoted or likely to get a raise, we want to be extra careful with what we might say. We don't necessarily want to get in the way of that person's livelihood or their chance to have a better living wage. On the other hand, when it comes to development or feedback, here appraisal tends to be less generous and more accurate. Why? Well, because like a coach, we want to make sure that people really know what they're doing well and what they're not doing so well. We don't want to sugarcoat anything. We don't want them to leave with the wrong impression. We want them to know precisely what they need to do in order to get better. Well, who does the rating in these performance appraisals? Traditionally, it's the supervisor, the boss, if you will. They tend to have more at stake when an employee is not performing well. That's one of the reasons why they want to be involved. They also tend to have access to greater resources, which might be needed to improve an employee's performance. So it makes a lot of sense that they would do the appraisal. Peers, customers, and subordinates or direct reports can also be raters. We talk about 360-degree feedback systems where we're getting feedback from the boss, we're getting feedback from people who work at the same level as us, we're getting feedback from the folks who report to us, and maybe even our customers. So as it says here, a 360-degree feedback is a system that gathers feedback from all those sources and then shares it with the employee, typically in an anonymous fashion for developmental purposes. I've had the privilege to help administer these systems for other people where I was the person who collected information from all those different sources and then shared it with the individual who was being evaluated. These kinds of appraisals are not often used in determining pay or promotion. Instead, they're used more for development and feedback. What makes for an effective appraisal system? 3 key characteristics. 1, adequate notice. People need to know exactly what criteria are going to be used to judge their effectiveness. In the same way that you need to know for any given assignment what criteria will be used to decide whether you've done a good job and how good of a job you've done. A fair hearing means that there will be two-way communication, that it won't just be the boss telling the employee what they think, but rather the employee will also have the opportunity to respond. And finally, judgment based on evidence. This involves documenting performance problems and using factual evidence as opposed to personal opinions. This can be very challenging, but it is so critically important because in reality, you and I, as we know from chapter 3, are subject to a whole host of biases, things that affect our ability to make good decisions, to perceive things accurately. And those biases, those stereotypes, can work against people who report to us. And we don't want that. We want to make sure that any performance appraisal accurately reflects what they're doing. Otherwise, when we try to tell them what we've perceived, if it's not factually based, what we tell them in order to improve might be just the opposite. We can talk about absolute versus relative rankings. An absolute rating, when we give these, depends only on the person's performance with respect to the objective criteria. So, for example, in this class, your leadership papers will be evaluated using a list of criteria. These are all in your syllabus. You can also see the rubric that I'll be using to evaluate your performance on that particular assignment. For each one of you, I'm going to read your individual paper, and I'm going to evaluate your paper against those criteria, one at a time, without taking into account how anybody else is doing, just you up against the performance criteria. That's a perfect example of absolute rating. Relative ranking, here what we're doing is judging people's performance as it compares to other people's performance. So, for example, rather than just here are the criteria, and here's how I define those, and here's what you did, and let's see how that compares to those criteria. Instead, I'd be looking at your paper relative to another student's paper and another student's paper. And I might decide in advance, for example, that of the 26 papers that will be submitted for this class, I'm going to give out, let's say, 5 A's and 5 B's and 5 C's. You can see where I'm going with this, right? And I just decide this is going to be the distribution. And then what I do as I grade is I'm saying, is your paper better than the paper I read before? Is it better than the one before that? Is it worse? In other words, I'm piling up this ranking. And then in the end, the top 5 will get A's. The next 5 will get B's. That's quite different from an absolute rating system. Going back to relative ranking, these are often viewed more negatively by employees, and you can see why. Again, imagine that I had decided I'm going to have 5 or 6 A's and 5 or 6 Bs and 5 or 6 Cs. And just depending on how you rank compared to the other people in class, that's what's going to decide which grade you get. You could very well be that person who ends up getting a B, whereas if I had used an absolute rating system, maybe you would have gotten an A. Everybody with me? So these relative rankings tend to be viewed pretty negatively. They can create a culture where low performance is not tolerated, even though that low performance could, in fact, in an absolute rating system, be considered pretty darn good. Again, think about me grading papers where maybe in the relative ranking system, your paper ends up with a C, whereas before it could have been a B, or you end up with a D when you could have had a C. And we simply decide anything below a C is failing. Yikes. With relative rankings, there's always the potential for a lawsuit. This can create a competitive, cutthroat environment where employees are less concerned about doing the best job possible to serve clients, let's say, and just focused on beating the other people with whom they work, knowing that if they're going to stay employed, if they're going to have any shot at a pay raise, they've just got to do better than the other people. It also has limited value in giving employees concrete feedback because basically what we end up telling people is you just need to be better than the other people. Even though you don't know how they're going to do, if you want to do well, you've just got to be better. There's no objective or absolute criteria that can be used for the person to think about and judge their performance against. So now it's just about competing with other people. Think about a situation where nobody's doing very well up against the objective criteria or the absolute criteria, but we're still telling people that they are doing well simply because they've done better than the other people who were doing even worse than they were. So essentially, we end up rewarding mediocrity because we're not using an absolute rating system. Again, I hope you can see the challenges associated with using relative ranking. For the longest time, the organization known as GE used an absolute ranking system in which anybody who ended up in the bottom 10% was let go. They were terminated. Those people could have been quite spectacular, actually, assuming that GE was hiring people who were quite good. Even the people in the bottom 10% could have been significantly better than, say, the people who might be in the top 10% in another organization. But it didn't matter. As long as Jack Welch was the CEO, that was the system they went with. You can imagine the problems that resulted. Well, they're all the ones that you see on the bottom of this slide. Again, we have to remember bias and how that might affect how we evaluate people. For example, when we like some of our employees better than others. One of the theories discussed in your text from chapter 5 that I didn't talk about in the narrated PowerPoint was leader-member exchange. Essentially, with leader-member exchange, we have a boss who likes some people better than others. Those people, the ones who are better liked, are part of the in group or the in crowd, and the rest of the folks are part of the out group or the outer crowd. Those people don't have access to the same resources as the people in the in group. Remember what we know about performance. Performance is a function of motivation, ability, and the environment, which includes resources. We know from leader-member exchange theory that the folks from the in group, honestly, they've got a better shot at being evaluated more positively. They're liked more, perhaps because they have more in common with the boss. Again, this is something that we need to be careful about. We also need to be careful about being lenient, which by definition means we're not being fair. So we cut some people slack, perhaps of something that we know about in their personal lives. That doesn't help the other people. Just because, for example, somebody at work doesn't have small children, we should still consider their performance even up against people who do have small children. We should be able to find a way to evaluate people without having to be lenient because of personal circumstances. And then there's the whole issue of stereotypes. What we think women ought to be like, what we think people from racial minorities ought to be like, what we think people who are more or less educated ought to be like, what we think people who are older or younger ought to be like. All kinds of things, all kinds of stereotypes can cause us to, in fact, yield unfair appraisals. None of these is good. All of them have the potential to create inequities, dissatisfaction, turnover, absenteeism, lower performance, higher deviant behavior, lower organizational citizenship behavior. You can see why this stuff matters. The last major topic is performance incentives. So within organizations, what do we do to try to extrinsically incentivize people? So other than making sure that people have a good job, again, that being the number one way to help people choose to be motivated because it really works on their intrinsic desires, their internal feelings and needs. We can talk about extrinsic incentives, things that the organization offers, things that are external to the individual that are intended to help that person choose to be motivated. So I'll fly through these pretty quickly. The first, piece rate systems. Under these, employees are paid on the basis of individual output. X number of things completed, X number of things made, X number of sales achieved, X number of clients contacted, and so on. These systems can work, when employee output is observable or quantifiable. So it is in fact possible to say, you met with X number of clients in the last quarter. You achieved X amount of sales in the last quarter. Also, when that output is correlated with employee effort, basically when we know that employees are having to work harder, remember that's intensity, and they're having to persist. They're going to have to keep at it. Individual bonuses, these are one-time rewards that follow specific accomplishments. So a person has done something specific. They have finished a project early. They have finished a project under budget. They have increased sales in a particular region, X amount percent higher than was expected. So then the organization might decide to give that person a one-time bonus or a monetary reward. Merit pay is not one-time bonus, it's continuing pay raise. So on top of what we call their base salary, we add another increment that continues going forward. Again, this is going to be based on performance. People do a great job, they merit, they warrant, they have earned an increase to their base pay. Sales commissions involve rewarding sales employees with a percentage of sales volume or profits generated. So this is different from bonuses. This is different from piece rate. This is you get paid based upon, you get 2% of net sales. You get 1% of profits after taxes, etc. The idea is to align these commission payments with the company's overall objectives, which could, for example, be growth in a given region of the country or the world. Employee recognition awards are methods that motivate employees through awards, plaques, some other kind of symbolic method of recognition. It could be something that's made public. It could be something that's quiet. Really depends on the individual employee in terms of which is going to be better. Some people really love a public recognition ceremony. Other people like me, not so much. If you must give me a plaque, I'll take it, but I'd really rather not show up for a big ceremony. In some cases, peers will be involved in nominating their coworkers for these awards. Sometimes it's just bosses. It really depends on the organization and its culture. Team bonuses are awarded to the individuals who participate in some team activity that yields some overall group goal, some overall group performance goal. These are going to work. These are going to help people choose to be motivated if it's really clear to people how what they do as individuals will influence that overall team's performance. If they can see a connection between what they do personally and how that influences the team, then team bonuses are more likely to incentivize motivation. Gain sharing and profit sharing, well, they both have the word sharing, but let's make sure we're not confused. Gain sharing, as it says here, is a company-wide program in which employees are rewarded for performance gains compared to past performance. So we've been tracking along, the organization overall has been tracking along here. Gain sharing is when that performance ratchets up, and now that extra increment, that gain, that's what's going to be used, distributed to employees. Maybe not all of it, some percentage of it will be distributed to employees. This is gain sharing. That encourages people to think, as a group, we need to ratchet up our organization's performance because we're going to get a share of those gains. Profit sharing is specific to some percentage of company profits. So remember all that good stuff you learned in the first accounting class, financial accounting? When you get down to the bottom line, the profits, okay. It doesn't have to be a gain necessarily over a previous quarter or year. It could just be an ongoing profit percentage that we will allow people, we will give people as part of their compensation package. Profit sharing can be a really great thing because it tends to be long-term, it tends to be fairly sustainable. I can give you the example of my father-in-law who worked for Procter & Gamble, and profit sharing was something that they routinely did. They may still do it, but he's been retired from Procter & Gamble for some time. And he was never going to leave Procter & Gamble. He loved working for Procter & Gamble because as that company did well, as their profits continued to be good year after year, the individual employees also did well. Finally, we have stock options. Stock options give employees the right, but not the obligation, to purchase company stocks at a predetermined price. And the whole idea is, once again, in particular in publicly traded organizations, to align company or organizational and employee interests by essentially making the employees owners. So they own company shares, company stock, and as a result, one would imagine, one would hope, that people will be making decisions that are consistent with that organization's success. That's the whole idea anyway. As you can see, there's quite a variety, quite a range of options that organizations can use besides just a typical paycheck in order to try and extrinsically incentivize motivation. Of course, remember, again, people choose to be motivated or not. Nothing an organization does can guarantee that people will choose to be motivated because fundamentally, nobody controls another human being. Only that person does. And whether extrinsic incentives matter, whether they have valence, to use the terminology from expectancy theory, well, that's going to depend on lots of factors that are unique to that individual. And that brings us to the end of chapter 6. Thanks.